And he reached out and he tried to shake my hand. And he said, "I'm sorry." Now, for the first time in my life, I got really angry. And I'm looking at that set of golf clubs, guys. And I'm thinking, I could take a golf club right now, wrap it around this guy's skull, and exact some kind of revenge for my aunt's murder. But then I would be in prison, not Fletcher Ivy. So I told him, I said, "Look, you're probably never going to be prosecuted for this crime. But I know you did it, and you know you did it. And I hope that you're, stuck in your own psychological prison for the rest of your life."
In this new episode, we speak with old friend and fantastic author Casey Sherman about the new documentary that he's in. It's called The Boston Strangler, Unheard Confession. And we talk all about the Boston Strangler case and about the death of his aunt, Mary Sullivan. Lance, what'd you think of this conversation?
It's always good to have Casey on. And I made a joke at the beginning of the episode that every time he comes on, it's about something that has currently become my favorite true crime topic, and just been fascinated with the Boston Strangler for years. And what he did was elevate that story to a level that I had never heard. I'm sure you had never heard. He drops about a dozen bombshells in the documentary and in this conversation because of the work that he's done on his own. Albert DeSalvo was not exclusively the Boston Strangler. There are so many reasons why, including DNA, and you hear Casey get into it, as well as a lot of other things, like how he knows who killed his aunt, Mary Sullivan, who was the last known victim, and suspiciously posed in a way where it was meant to look like previous Boston Strangler victims. And she was probably the most famous because of how gruesome it was. Tim, what did you think of this?
I loved this conversation. I thought you're right. There were bombshells in watching the documentary. My jaw dropped a few times. One of the times was because of the White Mountains being mentioned. The person that Casey believes actually murdered his aunt lived up in the White Mountains for the last 2 to 3 decades of his life. If what Casey believes is true, that would make this guy a murderer and walking free up there for, again, decades, and as a ski instructor as well. So that's kind of a wild angle to take away from this, because there are so many murders that are spoken about in the documentary. I never really had too many opinions on who I thought did these murders. I know DeSalvo is obviously commonly believed suspect, probably rightfully so to some degree, but it's just a lot more layer than I ever realized. It's really compelling.
Compelling is a great way to put it, and eye-opening too. And we can let the interview play out and everybody can have their opinion, but I just want to say right off the top, one thing that I didn't realize was that Albert DeSalvo was not in jail because he confessed to the Boston Strangler crimes. He was in jail because of his other crimes with assaulting women as the Measuring Man and the Green Man. He was never officially charged for the Boston Strangler crimes. Okay, yeah, like you said, jaw-dropping. Anyway, make sure you stay tuned towards the end of this, because Casey does talk about the time that he encountered that individual who you just spoke of, Tim, who was in northern New Hampshire, who he highly suspects of his aunt's murder. It's a really riveting piece of this conversation.
It's always great speaking with Casey Sherman. His books are incredible, and this new documentary is absolutely wild. So it aired on Oxygen at the end of October, and it is now able to stream on Peacock. So check that out. Let us know what you think.
All right, we're going to break real quick for a commercial, and we will return with our conversation with Casey Sherman about the Boston Stranglers. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the podcast, Casey Sherman. Casey, how are you today?
I'm doing great, guys. Thanks for having me back again.
Anytime you're on the show, that means that there's been this project that you've done that has blown our mind. And we had you on previously. I think it was Blood in the Water, right?
That's right. Yep. That was my last book. And then I've been involved in this documentary for a couple of years now.
I remember reading Blood in the Water, and it was among my favorite that you had done up to that point. And then you come back on with this documentary, which is now my favorite up until this point. So you're welcome to come back on anytime, because that means that I have a new favorite every single time.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
And even though you've been on the show numerous times, can you just reintroduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Casey Sherman. I'm a New York Times, USA Today, #1 best-selling author of 20 books now. Most of them are nonfiction. Most of them are true crime. I've written about Whitey Bulger. I've written about the Boston Marathon bombings that later became the film Patriots Day. I wrote Blood in the Water, which is you just mentioned. And I've got a book coming out next May called The Killer in Frank Lloyd Wright, which is about the world's greatest architect and a mass murder he was involved in very early in his career. But the story that really put me on the map, so to speak, is a story that's very close to me personally. It's a story about the Boston Strangler.
Yes, and you've got a new docu-series, or documentary actually, coming out on Oxygen on October 26th. It's called The Boston Strangler, Unheard Confession. Can you tell us about this documentary?
I reinvestigated my Aunt Mary Sullivan's murder case for, several decades. My aunt was the youngest and allegedly final victim of the notorious Boston Strangler, who had been murdering women in the Boston area from June 1962 to January 1964. Now, I didn't know my aunt, Mary Sullivan. I was born in 1969, 5 years after she'd been killed, but murders are multi-generational. And when a murder happens in the 1960s, it has an adverse effect on family members and the descendants, decades in the future, and certainly does now. I'd heard whispers about the Boston Strangler and my aunt growing up in an Irish Catholic household on Cape Cod. Things like that were never talked about. But when I was a teenager, I watched the film, The Boston Strangler, the first film starring Tony Curtis and Henry Fonda on Cablevision that night. And the next morning I broached the subject to my mother, Diane, who was 17 when her 19-year-old sister was murdered. And I said, Mom, just, tell me about Mary. And she said, Casey, Mary just wasn't my sister. Mary was my best friend. In a family of 6 Irish Catholic kids, they were the closest in age. They were closest in character. They were going to live their lives along parallel lines, raise their families together, grow old together. But all that was stolen from my mother because Mary was murdered on January 4th, 1964. And I looked at her, I said, Mom, at least they got the guy. And she looked up at me and she goes, Casey, I'm not sure they ever did. Now, guys, my mother didn't have any evidence to back up her beliefs. It was merely a sister's intuition. But it was a bond between two sisters that couldn't be broken even decades after the crime. And it was a bond that led me to journalism school at Boston University. And it was a bond that led me to where I am today.
Right. And that's got to do interesting things in your head, right? I mean, you want your aunt back. You would have loved to have your mom and her sister live out that scenario that they were going to raise the family, Christmases, Thanksgivings, all of that was going to happen. But if this didn't happen, you wouldn't have gone to journalism school probably, right? It wouldn't have been that spark that got you on this path.
Would I trade having my aunt here or having a relationship with her? 100%. There are other things that I could do. But really focusing on her murder investigation. And quite frankly, Lance and Tim, when I started, I wanted to prove that my mother was wrong, that police did get the right guy, Albert DeSalvo, because he was stabbed to death in prison in 1973. And at least, my family might have some kind of closure there. But as I began to peel the onion back and really investigate this case, meaning going out and interviewing everybody that was still alive who had a connection to this case, I began to realize that police got the wrong guy. And more importantly, they knew it. They knew that Albert DeSalvo wasn't who he claimed to be.
Okay, so can you take us through this a little bit, the story of DeSalvo, and I guess the idea that he could have committed some of these murders. Maybe he committed all of them. Maybe he didn't commit any of them.
Albert DeSalvo was a sexual predator. He was a con man, and he was a thief. Pretty bad guy. And he had been terrorizing Boston, not murdering women, but going and approaching women on the open streets and asking them to submit to his measuring stick, because he was passing himself off as a modeling representative. Now, here's a guy that would grope women on the streets, and any of these women that fought back or realized that he was doing something that was inappropriate or pushed back on him, Albert DeSalvo fled, because Albert DeSalvo was a coward. He wasn't a killer. He was a sexual predator, as I mentioned. But he had been arrested for unrelated sex crimes, posing himself off, as I mentioned, the measuring man and then the green man, because he was a maintenance man who got access to some of the apartments in Boston where he was assaulting women. Assaulting them, not murdering them. But he's in jail, looking at decades of jail time, and he had no means to support his family. He had a wife and 2 children on the outside, and his cellmate, a cold-blooded killer named George Nasser, approached him and said, Albert, there's a $110,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the Boston Strangler. You are already incarcerated. Why don't we say that you did it, because you're never getting out of jail, and we're not only going to get the reward money, but we're going to get money from a book and a movie deal, and I've got the lawyer that will broker those deals. That lawyer was a young, hungry Ihli Bailey, and that's what they did.
Okay, so Ihli Bailey, I think most people know him from the O.J. Simpson defense team, the famous dream team that O.J. Simpson assembled. In the 60s, you said he was young and hungry. What had he done up to that point?
He was beginning to be a household name, and that's a great question, Lance. He had just defended Sam Shepard, who was inspired the Fugitive TV series and film. And he was certainly becoming that major player in criminal defense in the United States. And he was representing George Nasser, as I mentioned, a cold-blooded killer and a man I believe was one of the real Boston Stranglers. And they got together and concocted a brilliant plan. They were going to sell Albert DeSalvo to the world as the Boston Strangler, and everybody was going to profit it. Now, why the Boston Police Department was so easily led in allowing DeSalvo to confess to these crimes, because in a 2.5-year period, the Boston Police had interviewed well over 300 suspects. And they had strong suspects in at least 6 of these cases, but for some reason, they could never bring murder charges against these individuals. So here comes a guy that won't just confess to one of the murders, he'll confess to all of them, tying this case up in a nice, neat bow. And what the public doesn't understand, guys, is that DeSalvo was never charged with any of the Boston Strangler murders, nor was he convicted. And the reason is because his confessions, the only thing that tied him to the cases, were majorly inaccurate.
And there might be some people out there who are thinking about Ihli Bailey's proposition and the money involved with these crimes, and they're probably thinking about the Son of Sam law or the Son of Sam rule, but that wasn't in effect at this time, right?
That wasn't in effect at this time because, David Berkowitz didn't go on his murder spree until the late 1970s. So in the early 1960s, criminals or suspects could actually profit from their crimes, which is what Albert DeSalvo did. He made money on a book deal. He made money on a movie deal. All that money went to his family, his wife and his kids. The wife ended up abandoning Albert DeSalvo. So Albert DeSalvo is sitting in prison. Bailey had convinced him that he could get Albert DeSalvo studied in a psychiatric hospital. That didn't happen. So Albert's in a jail cell at Walpole, and he's selling choker necklaces in the Walpole prison gift shop. He's writing poems and songs in his cell, a song called Strangler in the Night. He's living off of his notoriety as the alleged Boston Strangler. But in the early 1970s, DeSalvo decides, wait a minute, I'm serving a life sentence here for sex assaults. Now, he was given a life sentence because everybody believed he was the Strangler. And he thought, if I recant my confessions, if I tell the truth about what really happened in the 1960s, I might be able to get my freedom one day. And he reached out to his psychiatrist, Ames Roby, a man that I interviewed extensively in my reinvestigation. And he tells Roby, please come to Walpole tomorrow. I'm going to tell the whole story. And as Ames Roby is getting into his car, he turns on the radio and hears Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, stabbed to death in prison.
Was it ever known why he was killed in prison?
I interviewed the guards who were on duty that night. You know, there are some people in this documentary that you're going to see who claim to be experts on the case, but they've never investigated any of it. They've never talked to a suspect. They've never gone down the dark alleys that I had to in this case. And one of the guards that I interviewed said it was a paid hit, that the guards were all told to look the other way. Albert DeSalvo wasn't murdered in his jail cell. He was actually murdered in the Walpole Prison Infirmary. So the killer had to get through 6 security checkpoints with a knife, stab DeSalvo 19 times in the heart, get through those same 6 security checkpoints covered in blood, and nobody saw a thing. Well, the guard not only told me he looked the other way, but he told me who the real killer was of Albert DeSalvo. That killer's name was Vincent Flemmi. Now, the last name might be familiar to you guys because Vincent was Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi's brother, and he was a hitman for the mob. And he was taking out contract hits on the outside, and then when he was arrested for murder, started taking out contract hits on the inside of Walpole, and he murdered Albert DeSalvo.
Wow, that is wild, and the connections here are incredible too. Is it your idea that Nasser sort of convinced DeSalvo and maybe gave him some of the information from potential murder scenes that Nasser actually committed?
I think that's very accurate. I think George Nasser was able to put Albert DeSalvo at a couple of those crime scenes. And when DeSalvo was giving his confession, which, lasted well over 60 hours, that material is played for the first time in the documentary. Now, I mention the confessions because the confessions were the holy grail of the Boston Strangler case. The confessions were stolen from the evidence locker at the Boston Police Department because investigators were taking and stealing, evidence, mementos that they would later hold in their, trophy cases. There's one investigator, and you see it in the documentary, Phil DiNatale, who took home all of his case files from the Boston Police Department. Those case files don't belong to Phil DiNatale. They belong to the Boston Police Department. So I tracked down the confession tapes, and they were in the custody of a minor investigator working on the periphery of the case, all 60 confession tapes. And I put them up to the autopsy reports and the crime scene reports and the murders. Albert DeSalvo's confessions didn't match up to the crimes.
There's a moment where Albert DeSalvo is described as having a photographic memory and him forgetting, especially the last victim, your aunt, forgetting incredible details like the Happy New Year card that's left at her foot. I mean, that's something that the killer shouldn't forget. I mean, it was an intentional placement of that card. And then we are told that DeSalvo is basically this dim-witted individual. I mean, I'm surprised that he was even functioning in the world, but he never looks like that in the pictures. And in anything that you see, he always looks like he's got something going on. I mean, he's got this like kind of devious look in his eyes. Was he a photographic memory guy? Was he dim-witted?
He wasn't dim-witted at all. And, and this is based on the study that Dr. Ames Roby conducted on Albert DeSalvo after he was arrested. So it's Ames Roby who came out and said, this man has a photographic memory. This man could come into any room and tell you where everybody was sitting during a meeting 2 weeks prior. So, you're getting conflicting reports about, DeSalvo's mental acuity in the documentary. I base my opinions on the exact psychiatrist who is studying Albert DeSalvo over a course of over a year, and not somebody that really doesn't have any connection to the case beyond his father's work on the case.
Now, what about some of these other characters like Charles Terry, Jules Rothman? Can you describe how they kind of come into play in this?
The great thing about this documentary, it doesn't just show you why Albert DeSalvo may not be the Boston Strangler. It shows you who could have committed those murders. You mentioned Charles Terry. Charles Terry was a homicidal maniac who had committed a murder that went unsolved in his home state of Maine in the early 1950s. Later went to prison for a series of rapes he committed in Maine. He was living in Boston in the summer of 1962 when the Boston Strangler murder case really began. He was living with his grandmother in South Boston. A year later, Charles Terry is arrested in New York City for murdering a mature woman who was in her early 60s, strangling her with her scarf and leaving her dead in a hotel room, while also physically assaulting her body post-mortem. He was immediately arrested in Greenwich Village within 48 hours of that crime. New York police detectives heard his confession to that case. They called the Boston Police Department and said there are some eerie similarities between the murder that we're investigating and the unsolved murders in Boston. Several of the homicide detectives went down to interview Charles Terry in New York while he was in custody. Terry wouldn't talk to them. Terry clammed up. Terry wouldn't say a word to the Boston Police Department about those open cases.
And the similarities between that and the series of murders that happened that are attributed to like the first batch of the Boston Stranglings is almost verbatim.
Almost verbatim. And these were all older women living alone, murdered. Some of them were sexually assaulted, like Charles Terry's victim in New York. Others weren't. Most of them were robbed. Charles Terry did rob his victim of $600 in traveler's checks. Her gold cigarette case was found on his person when he was arrested. His victim was also left in a very provocative pose, much like some of the older victims were in the Boston Strangler case. So they were eerily similar. Jules Rothman, and it's great you point out Jules Rothman. Jules Rothman was having an affair with one of the victims, Patricia Bissett, a young woman who had grown up in Vermont and was working as a secretary for an engineering firm that Jules Rothman was involved in Kenmore Square. Jules Rothman had a wife and 2 adult children. Jules Rothman was having an illicit affair with Patricia Bissett, and Patricia Bissett was 1 month pregnant at the time she was killed. The only items taken out of her apartment when she was murdered were photographs that were eventually found in the desk of Jules Rothman at his office in Kenmore Square. Her friends had told me and other investigators that she was going to confront Jules and his wife at a New Year's Eve party about the pregnancy, but she was murdered on New Year's Eve morning.
I'm sure police followed up on all of this.
Yes. James Mellon interviewed Jules Rothman. Jules Rothman was given not 2, but 3 polygraph tests, and he failed them. It was going to the grand jury, the Rothman case and Patricia Bissett. But when Albert DeSalvo came out of the blue and not only would confess to one of the murders, but all of them, John Bottomley, the head of the Boston Strangler Task Force, told investigators like Jim Mellon, put all of your suspects away because we're going with DeSalvo.
I mean, what does that do to an investigation? It should really, in my head, cause them to say, maybe these aren't connected to the other series of murders. You know, this is a one-off where it's obviously a crime of passion, and we need to take what DeSalvo's saying with a grain of salt here.
100%. And it's a great question, Lance, because if you go back and you look at exactly what the Boston police officials were saying at the times of these murders, they were saying these are copycats. Not one person is responsible for all these crimes. They said that every day during this investigation, all the way up to 1965 when DeSalvo comes out of the blue and confesses to all of them. And then they completely changed their tune. Well, he must have done all of them, I guess.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Now, there's a witness in the documentary, Adele Roof. She has a really wild story.
She had been confronted by Albert DeSalvo outside of her apartment on Park Drive, exactly where Patricia Bissett was living. He had measured her. He had visited her again in her apartment or tried to get access to her apartment. She would not let him in, and he was masturbating outside of her front door. Now, she claimed that she was living in the exact apartment that Patricia Bissett was living in, but that's not the case. Patricia Bissett was living in another apartment inside the building. But it's interesting that DeSalvo had visited that building prior to Bissett's murder. So that calls into question, did he commit that one killing? Possibly, but I would say that the more likely suspect in that case is Jules Rothman. We know DeSalvo loved to, break into buildings, visit crime scenes. He visited most of the crime scenes after these women were murdered, obviously. But his connection to that particular building raises some red flags. But I look at it as, okay, this woman has an incredible story to tell. And I'm sure she's, mostly accurate in her retelling of it. But that DeSalvo at no time put his hands on her and attempted to murder her, like the killer did with Patricia Bissett. Now, Patricia Bissett had coffee with her killer, which I believe is Jules Rothman. She invited this person in. This person wasn't a stranger. This is at the height of the Boston Strangler case. No single woman in Boston is inviting any stranger into their apartment, regardless of why he claims he's there.
Patricia Bissett was found, I think it was described as the most caring crime scene of all of them, because all of them, for the most part, there were violations done to their bodies that were horrific, but she was covered.
She was covered right up to her neck with a blanket. She had ligatures wrapped around her neck. She had obviously been strangled. She was not sexually assaulted by her killer. The autopsy report, as I did mention, she was 1 month pregnant at the time she was murdered. But, she looked like a sleeping doll in her bed with her hands not bound behind her like some of the other victims had been, but closely by her side, as if she was laid there like Sleeping Beauty.
And can you tell us about the tapes themselves? And before we get into how you acquired them, the person who's interviewing DeSalvo wasn't a seasoned veteran investigator or anyone who is equipped to handle something of the significance of the Boston Strangler. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. John Bottomley was assigned by Edward Brooke, who was the Attorney General of Massachusetts at the time, to lead the Boston Strangler Task Force. John Bottomley had no prior experience in a criminal courtroom or an interrogation session. John Bottomley was a real estate lawyer who Ed Brooke thought was highly organized. That's why Bottomley was allowed to lead the task force. So here's John Bottomley investigating and interrogating, at that point, the most notorious alleged killer in American history. And John Bottomley has no experience in how to conduct any of these interrogations. So John Bottomley, and you see this in the documentary, is sharing evidence with Albert DeSalvo and leaving him to give and provide the answers that John Bottomley wanted. It's mind-boggling that was allowed to happen.
Can you tell us about Daniel Panaccio and this victim, Beverly Sammons?
Sure. Beverly Sammons was murdered in May of 1963 in Cambridge on University Road. Beverly was a very accomplished mezzo-soprano singer. She was also in graduate school, getting a degree in music therapy, and she would give music lessons to developmentally delayed people or students at the Fernald School, which was eventually a notorious school located in Waltham, Massachusetts, that was really abusing, young developmentally delayed students. Well, Daniel Panaccio was a student there, and Beverly was offering him and providing him music lessons in her apartment on University Road. Shortly after the murder, Daniel Panaccio was arrested for gazing under women's bathroom doors at a local hospital. And when he is brought in for questioning, he's questioned about Beverly Sammons, because everybody at the time was being questioned about Beverly Sammons. And he not only confesses but offers a detailed confession about how he murdered her, stabbing her 17 times in the chest and neck with a paring knife that he left in her kitchen. So he signs a confession, but shortly after him signing a confession, he is assigned a public defender. That defender goes to the judge and says, my client is highly delusional, he's highly suggestible, and he lied in his confession, although he was giving details about Seaman's murder that nobody else had, other than police detectives. So Panaccio is released without getting arrested, and within a month, he is killed in a diving accident in the waters of South Boston. He had jumped off a bridge, hit his head on a rock, and died.
Ah, okay. How does his confession align with DeSalvo's description of how he, quote, left the crime scene?
Daniel Panaccio was on point. He knew exactly how Beverly Seamans was murdered because he committed that murder. Albert DeSalvo claimed that he had only stabbed Seamans just a few times. Now, the fact that Seamans was stabbed was printed in the newspapers at the time, so DeSalvo knew that information. And then DeSalvo tells John Bottomley that he took the murder weapon, which he described as a switchblade knife, and threw it in a marsh. That was completely inaccurate because Seamans was murdered with a paring knife. That bloodied murder weapon was found in her kitchen sink.
Why is it, in your opinion, that when those contradictions come up, law enforcement will say, well, he's just mixing up details? I mean, we're just sort of splitting hairs here.
Sure.
And then other ones are like so on point, like, well, obviously he would know this. What's your opinion on how it changes based on what the theories are?
Well, there are some people that just are so stuck in their belief. And I don't even think they believe Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, but, they want to, carry this myth on into, 2025 and 2026, but the facts don't add up to their assumptions that Albert DeSalvo committed these murders. The one thing that connected him to the crimes was his confession tape, and he got glaring information completely wrong in those confession tapes. Therefore, in my opinion, and the opinion that of anybody that looks at this case objectively, is immediately going to say, wait a minute here. DeSalvo didn't do it, but these other suspects certainly could have committed these crimes.
Yeah, so many stories here that kind of overlap. It is wild. And can you tell us about your Aunt Mary's case?
My Aunt Mary was murdered on January 4th, 1964 at 44A Charles Street in Beacon Hill. She was just moving in her belongings into the apartment that morning. She was found that evening by two of her roommates who were coming home from work. When they entered the apartment, they called out her name. She didn't answer. When they finally opened the door, they found her body propped up in a bed. She was strangled with 3 ligatures, 2 scarves and a nylon stocking, all wrapped very tightly around her neck. As you mentioned prior, the killer left a Happy New Year card, a macabre kind of calling sign by her left foot. It was probably, the most grisly Boston Strangler murder scene because she had also been sexually assaulted with a broomstick, which was still inside her body when police found her. Now, my grandparents, Mary's parents, guys, they didn't get a call from the Boston police that night about their daughter's murder. Instead, my grandfather got a call from a reporter from the Boston Globe who asked him, do you have a daughter named Mary Ellen Sullivan? Now, my grandfather said, no, my daughter's name is Mary Ann Sullivan. You see, my grandfather had forgotten that she had changed her name during Catholic confirmation. And then when he realized his mistake, guys, he said, oh my God, is she in the hospital? And the reporter said callously, no, your daughter is in the morgue. That's how my family found out.
God, I'm so sorry. That's so callous. Wow.
It's brutally callous, but police were on to a prime suspect almost immediately. There was a young man, a 19-year-old Boston University student named Fletcher Ihli, who was found on the street that night as the body of my aunt is being carried out on a stretcher. Now, Fletcher Ihli was dating one of Mary's roommates at the time. Fletcher was an insanely young, jealous kid who believed that his girlfriend was having an affair with somebody else, and she was. There was evidence taken from my aunt's apartment, love letters from the roommate to this gentleman in the United States Navy. And Fletcher wanted to get evidence of that affair. So the night before Mary was murdered, Fletcher stole the apartment key off of his girlfriend's keychain. That apartment key was missing from his girlfriend. The next morning, he broke into the apartment. There was no forced entry inside the apartment. And as he's rifling through her belongings, Mary is bringing her belongings, her suitcase, into the apartment. She sees him doing this, confronts him, obviously. There's an argument that becomes very violent. Now, Mary was a tough Irish kid from a tough Irish family. She could give as good as she got, but he was stronger than her, and he killed her. Strangled her with 3 ligatures, as he had been almost told to do through the newspaper accounts of the Boston Strangler murders, and then it made it look like a Boston Strangler crime scene.
It's interesting that you said as if he was almost told to do it through the newspapers, because they didn't really hold back a lot of details.
They held back zero detail. If you wanted to kill a woman from 1962 to 1964, you had a blueprint for how to commit a Boston Strangler murder because all the details were printed in the newspapers at the time. Now, the newspapers also printed inaccurate information, and it's worth noting that those details were later regurgitated by Albert DeSalvo during his confession. He was regurgitating false information that was printed in the newspapers that he had read about.
Was that intentionally printed?
No. That was just, reporters going off script because, the reporters were allowed into the crime scenes. Many of them were. The crime scenes were really not secured at the time. Now, reporters and anybody could walk into a Boston Strangler crime scene hours and days after these murders were committed before all of the evidence had been taken out of these apartments.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this Fletcher Ihli story here. So how come this Fletcher Ihli guy wasn't charged?
He should have been. Not only was he calling police asking them for information about Mary's murder, Jim Mellon, one of the amazing investigators who's profiled in this documentary, brought Fletcher in, questioned him, gave him 3 lie detector tests, which he failed. An eyewitness living across the street from Mary's apartment looked inside her apartment that morning when Mary was murdered and saw a man fitting Fletcher's unique description. Fletcher had bright red hair, and there was a bright red-haired man inside the apartment when this eyewitness was able to look in. But again, as Mellon is building his case against Fletcher Ihli, here comes Albert DeSalvo, who is going to confess to Mary's murder. So Fletcher just disappears afterwards. He drops out of Boston University, and he becomes a ghost until I tracked him down decades after the crime. And I found out that he had fled to northern New England, and of all things, he had become a golf pro at a golf resort in northern New England, and I got his phone number. And I called him, and I asked him if he was willing to take a DNA test that might, exonerate him from the murders because he had been identified as the prime suspect. And he told me flat out that he would not do it. At that point, I connected with his employer, who owned a bar in this ski town in northern New England. And that gentleman, Tom Gross, is interviewed in the documentary. And Fletcher comes to him with a unique story. There's something I'm afraid of in my past. Something that has to do with Mary Sullivan and the Boston Strangler. Now, when I spoke to Tom Gross, I said, Tom, if he's going to confess to anybody, he can confess to you. Now, I can't use it in a court of law, but I can use it. And more importantly, can you try to get his DNA, which Tom Gross ultimately does. Now, as the viewers will see in the documentary, we had to have my aunt's remains exhumed and tested for DNA. And we also exhumed Albert DeSalvo's remains for DNA. I've actually held DeSalvo's skull in my hands. The DNA that was extracted from Fletcher Ihli was sent to the lead in forensic investigators, and we're talking about Henry Lee. We're talking about Michael Baden. All of the greatest forensic scientists in the country worked on this case. And they found evidence of Mary's killer in her body. That evidence did not match Albert DeSalvo. That evidence matched Fletcher Ihli.
I mean, it's an amazing moment in the documentary because it's DNA. I mean, there have been advancements since then, but back then it was pretty reliable.
Very reliable and utilized by the greatest minds in forensic science. So that was really obviously a smoking gun for me with regard to Fletcher's involvement in this case. I needed to get Fletcher's story myself. How do I do it, right? Tim and Lance, I could, show up at his house. I had his address in northern New England. I could knock on his door and he could take a gun or a shovel, and beat me over the head or shoot me and throw me in the woods and, nobody would see or hear from Casey Sherman again. So I'd confront him in a public place and I booked a golf lesson under an assumed name with him at the resort. And I met him at the resort and took off my disguise. And it was like the ghost of Christmas past had come back to haunt him.
But how did that conversation go?
At first he would not talk. He said, I won't talk to you without a lawyer present. But then all he could do was talk. So over the course of 45 minutes, we're engaging in a conversation. And during that conversation, he begins to stutter. Now, Fletcher had a speech impediment. And why that was relevant to me is because when I interviewed Mary's roommates, one of them said 2 weeks after Mary was killed, she got a phone call late at night from a drunken young man with a stutter who said, I'm going to do to you what I did to that Mary bitch. Shut your mouth. Here, 35 years later, comes that stutter again.
Wow. So you spoke with him for 45 minutes.
He gave me an alibi. I said, Fletcher, what were you doing on January 4th, 1964? And he said, I remember it, vividly. I was watching a college football game with my mother and my uncle. This is what Fletcher had told me. And I said, well, that's convenient because I'm sure they're both dead and they can't corroborate where you were at the time. And he said, yeah, that's right. Then he reached out and he tried to shake my hand. And he said, I'm sorry. Now, for the first time in my life, I got really angry. And I'm looking at that set of golf clubs, guys. And I'm thinking, I could take a golf club right now, wrap it around this guy's skull, and exact some kind of revenge for my aunt's murder. But then I would be in prison, not Fletcher Ihli. So I told him, I said, look, you're probably never going to be prosecuted for this crime. But I know you did it, and you did it. And I hope that you're, stuck in your own psychological prison for the rest of your life. I had to leave the golf course. And I walked away and I got into my car and I drove back to Boston. And all the time, guys, I'm thinking, how do I prove whether Fletcher Ihli's alibi is fictional or whether it's the truth? And I was working as a TV producer at WBZ TV4 at the time. It's one of the oldest TV stations in America. And that station has archives of every television program going back to the 1950s. So I found the booklet of January 1964. I opened it up to January 4th, and there it was, no football games played or televised. So Fletcher Ihli was, again, lying in his alibi to me about where he was that day.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, it was in the catacombs of the TV news station. It was almost a bit Indiana Jones-esque. There were cobwebs and crickets all over this dusty old basement. But after about an hour of just going through year after year, I finally found January 1964, and there it was.
Now, this Fletcher Ihli guy, do you have any knowledge of what he was up to from then until when you spoke with him? And I know that he died, I think, in 2020.
He died in 2020. There are allegations against him that he, every relationship that he got himself into, he was incredibly abusive. And there's one gentleman that recounts a certain incident involving Fletcher in the documentary. He was a very, violent person. I think he was ultimately fired from his job for having, hardcore pornography on his computer or something to that effect. But here was a guy, did he commit another murder? I'm not sure about that.
So you did all of your work with the DNA connection, and then sort of miraculously, law enforcement has discovered new DNA or existing DNA for the first time. Can you go into that and even to the press conference and how you appear to have a change of heart?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I was told by the Attorney General's office countless times that there was never any evidence to test. All the evidence was missing from my aunt's murder. 200 items taken from her apartment. And then out of the blue in 2013, I get a call from somebody at the Suffolk County DA's office saying that they miraculously found evidence. And I said, well, where did this evidence come from? Oh, from a blanket in Mary's apartment. I said, okay, because I was told that there wasn't any evidence left from her crime scene. There was a mad rush to a news conference the next morning where the authorities in Boston told the world that they had DNA evidence that tied Albert DeSalvo to the blanket inside Mary's apartment. Therefore, Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler and he murdered my aunt. And I was, kind of thrust in front of the cameras that day, guys. And I almost don't even remember that moment because it was a fog of war moment for me where I was hoping to learn more about the information well before I was thrown into the press scrum to talk about this case. And as they were talking more and more about Albert DeSalvo in the press conference, I was trying to bring that press conference back to Mary and who she was. But I didn't necessarily have all of the information or the facts with regard to this new DNA investigation to really talk about adequately. So I was just really talking from the heart.
The first time that you made the connection between this Fletcher Ivy, who you believe murdered your aunt, you took that information to your mom, and it appeared like there was a bit of closure there. Is that true? How did your mom react to that?
She's the hero of this story. She never gave up hope that Mary's killer would be identified. We believe that we identified the right person, and she said, Mary can rest now. Mary can rest. Going back to Albert DeSalvo's confession of his alleged role in Mary's murder, again, not only did he say that he strangled her with his bare hands, which was not true. We know that because when we did the re-exhumation of Mary's remains, her hyoid bone, which was a very fragile neck bone, was still intact in her body. Pathologist Michael Baden found coffee residue in her stomach, which showed investigators that she was murdered in the morning. DeSalvo claimed that he had killed her in late afternoon. Well, when the medical examiner discovered her body at 6:30, she was in full rigor mortis. That takes 6 to 7 hours to happen, not 2 hours as DeSalvo had claimed. Now, the Suffolk County DA's office, they don't want to talk about that information. They just want to lean on a seminal stain found on a blanket in her apartment as their smoking gun in this case. But DeSalvo told Ames Roby several times during his examinations that he visited the crime scenes, that he was in Mary's apartment. Now, evidence had been left in Mary's apartment for days, after her murder before it was all collected. So DeSalvo wasn't in just Mary's apartment. He was in Anna Slessor's apartment. He was in Helen Blake's apartment. He had access to these crime scenes after the murders had taken place.
The documentary has been produced. You in your heart know that you've figured out who murdered your aunt, not connected to the Boston Strangler series of murders, either one of those batches, right?
Correct. To me, it's more terrifying, guys, that I think, the Strangler itself is a myth. I'm going back to even today and looking back at all of the murders of women in the greater Boston area from 1962 to 1964, and it's mind-boggling. There weren't just 11 women strangled and murdered in the greater Boston area. There were more than 20 women strangled in the greater Boston area. People compare this case to Jack the Ripper. And I think it's more similar to the Salem witch trials, because there was a certain hysteria that took hold of the greater Boston area in this time of innocence in the early 1960s, where women were subjected to these brutal crimes. It's shocking to look back at the volume of homicides that were committed during this time in greater Boston and around the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
So is the story continuing for you then?
It's interesting. I had put this story away because, I write a book a year. I'm always engaged in an active investigation of some sort. But a year ago, another Boston Strangler movie premiered starring Keira Knightley. And Keira Knightley played a journalist in the 1960s investigating the Boston Strangler case. Now, the person that she played in the movie was a real person, Loretta McLaughlin, who was working for the Boston Herald at the time. And I'm watching the movie with my wife, and every scene, Keira Knightley's character is uncovering evidence that McLaughlin didn't uncover. I uncovered that evidence, including the confession tape. So, my wife was saying, if in the next scene Keira Knightley is listening to the confession tapes, we're suing the Hollywood studio that, put this out. Sure enough, that becomes the next scene. And I told my wife, I said, look, I'm not going to sue. It is what it is. The story's getting out there, and I'm okay with it. But shortly thereafter, the production company that worked on the documentary said, Casey, it's time to tell the real story, your story. And I said, let's go for it.
Very cool. Thank you so much for spending some time with us here today and telling us all about these cases and about your aunt's case. And this documentary is amazing. I hope our audience checks it out. It is really compelling. Just a whole lot of moving pieces in this story.
Yeah, a whole lot of moving pieces. It begins to stream on NBC Peacock on Monday the 27th. So I hope everybody will watch it and, again, come away with their own truth, if you will.